Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is the first in a video series on building a Ruby on Rails application with authentication using Vue on the front end. And then if I have time, maybe I'll even do a bonus and actually do a front end in Angular and React. We'll see how this goes. But first, let's build the actual back end of the app. So we're going to create a new Ruby on Rails application. So I got my terminal open up to my Rails folder. So I'm going to type in Rails new to create a new Rails project. This is going to be a blog app, so a very straightforward blog app. So Rails new, blog app, and actually we'll make it a notes app, so that way it's even simpler. Rails new, note app, and that should be fine, but I don't need views. Okay, meaning I don't need all the Ruby features or the Rails features that allow me to create templates for the front end. Okay, I'm going to do a whole separate front end app that consumes an API, and I'm going to use Postgres as my database. So in that case, I'd rather just have that set up already. Okay, so I'm going to have database, to do a flag that says database equals PostgreSQL. So that way it sets it out automatically for Postgres. And then a flag that says API, so that way all the front-end Vue stuff gets removed from the template, which is going to set up quicker. I'm going to hit enter on that. Okay, cool. Spring inserted, been right, good. Okay, now, so that's all good. So let me cd into that folder. cd note app. Okay, and let's open it up over here. Now what I want to do is I'm going to configure my database first. So that's in config database.yaml. Okay, so it has all this stuff. And just so you know how this reads, this is the default information. And by doing this, you're able to reuse the default information over and over again. This you don't really need to change, so you can leave that as is. Okay, and what we can do now for the production app, I always change this over here. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of database username and password. We're going to not need that because we're just going to use a database URL. So I just copy this from over here and ta-da. So that way when you deploy to Heroku, it's just going to automatically work. What I do need to work on is my two databases for local testing. Okay, so there's a database name, which is fine. I just need a username and password. Okay. Which, how does that look like? Control Z is username and password. Okay. So redo, Control Y. Okay. So I need to add the username and password to these. Username. Okay, and let's create a whole new Postgres user so you guys can see how to do this. I always just create locally a test super user, so I just do this. So PSQL to go into your Postgres, assuming you have Postgres installed on your computer, and then the command is just create user. I'm going to call it test3 with super user that gives it super user privileges. With super user, and then we're going to set the password, and we'll set the password to test3 as well. Okay, I wouldn't set your normal like production database passwords always with super user. Create like database specific users, but you know, again, this is a practice project, so this will be easier. Okay, so create user test3 with super user privileges, so I can work in any of my databases on my computer. Password 3 test is test3. So once I do that, semicolon, because it's this SQL command. Oh, didn't like something. Oh, yep, I know why. This needs quotation marks. Doot. And there you go. We now have a new user. So now I want to quit out of Postgres, so \Q. Okay, and now I can do this. So username test3, password test3, Then I also want to set up the port. Okay, which is going to be 5343 if I remember correctly. I think it might actually be labeled here. Yep, 5432 is the right answer. 5432, that's the default Postgres database, which is what I should be running on. And host, which is localhost. Okay, and that should be what I need. So I'm going to copy that over to here. Oh, I don't need that part. Doot. Okay. And that should configure my database. Okay. Save. Okay. Now what I want to do also before I go any further with my database is make sure that my gem file has all the needed libraries. So I'm going to go to my gem file, node app, gem file. And if you're new to Ruby, your gem file is kind of like your package.json in Node. It lists all your dependencies. So just want to make sure that it has Postgres PG in there. And then I also want to unlock bcrypt, because we're going to use that for our passwords. So I'm just going to uncomment that out. And the other one I want rack cores, so let's uncomment that one out. Okay, and there's one more that I want. I think that one I'm going to have to type in. And for that, I do have that in my tutorial for this topic. So if you go to toots.alexmercedcoder.com, you'll go to my new tutorial blog where I'm actually writing out text tutorials now. And there's my Ruby on Rails API with JWT Auth tutorial. And I think it's just JWT now that I think about it. So gem JWT, there it is. That's easy. Gem JWT. Okay, and just to make sure that everything, that all these are installed, so JWT, bcrypt, and rack cores. Cores is just for managing your permissions. Okay, JWT is for JWT tokens, which we'll use for authentication, and bcrypt is for encrypting passwords. So I'll just run a bundle install to make sure that all those are installed. Bundle install. Okay, there was some error parsing define local variables, get gem file. Why didn't you like that? Oh, because I always type in get. It's gem JWT. Save, let's try that again. Okay. Cool. Okay, so it installed what it needed. So that's all set. Okay. So now let's just check if my database configurations are correct. And the way I can do that is to see if the databases I need get created. So I'm going to run Rails db create. And if my database settings are correct, it should create my test and development databases. So Rails db.create. So it's doing the thing. Create a database, node app development, so that's success. Create a database, node app test, success. Okay, cool. So we have our databases. Now what we want to do is start building out some stuff. So let's get back to my tutorial. Okay, so we did all that. Now we want to configure cores, so we can just copy this straight out from here. And we need to go to config initializers cores. That's where we need to go. So let's try that out. Config initializers cores. Now, if you're not familiar with what cores is, it stands for cross-origin resource sharing. And what it will do is that it's a security measure that's built in the browsers, and you need to build in certain headers. The library kind of takes care of that for you, but you need to specify sort of which URLs can make requests to your server. Okay. So you would put like origins like example.com, and these would be places that you can, and then these are the things that are allowed to get. Asterisk always means everything. So really I'm just changing this to this. So this means anyone can make a request to my server, and they can request anything. Okay, and that just makes it easy for now. While we develop, we can always go back and change that later once we deploy to production. Okay, cool. So that's done. Now we need to set up our routes. We're going to set up 3 routes. Okay, and I did this based on this template over here. Okay, so at least the auth part. Once we get past the auth part, like, then that's not adapted from that template or that tutorial, just because I want to add more detail explaining what certain things did. Okay, so let's copy this piece, and we need to go to our routes. Our routes should be in the same folder. So in the config folder, scroll down and you find routes. And right now we don't have any real routes, so I'm just going to paste this right over. So essentially, again, the resource command, what it does, it creates all the RESTful routes for the model in question. So this is creating all the RESTful routes for users. But we only want these routes. So it's only creating the create route for the user's model, which we did not create yet. This is creating a special post route that points to the /login endpoint, and that will take advantage of the user's model, assuming it has a function or controller called login. So it'll run that function whenever we hit post, a post to login. And then auto login will do a get to auto login URL and see if run the auto login controller, because that's how this reads. This is the model or the controller, and which function on that controller is it going to run when it hits that route. So that's kind of how this reads. Okay, so that's done. Now we're going to create the user model. Okay, I'm use this command here, and I'll walk you through what this command does. Oh. Okay, so that just created the model. Come back to that. But let's see here. Rails G stands for Rails generate. So we're generating. What are we generating? A model. What's the name of that model? User. And it has 2 properties. Username string. So it's username, which is a string. And then password digest. So the idea is that this whole digest piece, that's what tells bcrypt that it should intend on encoding that particular, or encrypting that particular item in our model. Okay, so we don't just put password, we have to put password digest, because that's what bcrypt is looking for. That way bcrypt just is automatically set up and we don't have to think about it. And then age integer. Okay, yeah, I guess the age of the user, that's not necessarily necessary. But yeah, okay, that's fine. Cool. Now that we have that, we're going to want to first, before we migrate, let's just make sure we do a couple things. So we want to add this has secure password. That is going to notify Rails that it wants to run bcrypt here. So we basically did the digest field, so that way the database knows. Now we need to make sure that the model knows. So we have to go to the model, which would be in the app folder, under models, and then we see the user model, and then we're just going to add that one macro. And this function will just basically build out the functionality for bcrypt. That's what all it does. Okay? So just make sure that it has a secure password. Okay, then we need to make a controller. Again, the difference between the model and the controller, the model is where we specify like the object. How does the user object behave? In the controller, we say when people request routes related to the user object, how are those routes handled? Okay, so we're going to create that controller. Pretty straightforward command. Okay, Rails G controller users. Okay, and that's just going to create a users controller. And that's going to match our routes, because again, we're looking for a users controller. Okay, and that controller is going to go back, exist back in app. So there's a folder called controllers. And there's users controller. Right now it's just empty. So now that we have that set up, we're going to go migrate our database. We already set up our database, so we don't need to worry about that part. We just need to do the migration. So So it's a migrate, and basically what happened was when we created the model, so when we did like Rails G model, it created a migration file. And that's going to be in the database folder, migrate. And this migrate file, what it does, it's going to tell Rails how to create the table in our database, a table called users. So it's going to basically say that, hey, we have a username field, which is a string, a password digest field, which is a string because it's just going to represent the encrypted password, and an age field, which is an integer, which doesn't matter. Not quite sure why I had that in there. Probably a typo. Okay, but one doesn't affect anything. So then what you do is you do Rails DB migrate. Rails DB migrate, that's going to migrate the table. So that migrated the thing just fine. Good. Now that that is migrated, what we need to do next, take a look at the tutorial. We need to seed some data. We need to create like an initial user. So I'm just going to copy this same one again. And you do that in the DB folder. You're going to see this file called seed. You can just add lines here for what you want to migrate. Okay. So I'm going to create a user called username. You might want to create a few users. Okay, but the idea is that this will just create a whole bunch of a way of creating data in there. Okay. Yeah, so that's that. And then all you do to do that is you do Rails DB :seed. And that'll run that seed file and see the database. Okay, and that was done. Okay, and just to confirm that was added, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the Rails console. This takes me into sort of like a terminal for like Ruby with my application loaded into it, so I can access all my objects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if we get that object. So I'm going to type in user.find, and since it's the only one we created, it should be ID 1. So user.find 1, and there it is. Alex Merced, age 35. Again, the password's filtered because it's protected. And yeah, so it works. Alex was created. Okay. So, the next step is now we need to start creating all our controller functions. And considering this is a user, we probably would want to delete this afterwards, so that we don't end up creating that same user again, or that user's password doesn't show up in your GitHub. Just something to think of. Although it might be in the, let me just see if that's already in the git ignore. Does the seed file belong in the git ignore? No, I don't see it in there. temp.pids. Yep, nope. So in that case, yeah, I would make sure you delete that, considering we're creating a user. Okay. So here we're going to copy these functions right out of there, because this is going to be the exact same way every time. So I'm going to head over to our controller for users and just paste this right over. Okay. Oh, Control Z, wrong place. Actually, we're going to go to this application controller. Now, what application controller is, it's basically the prototype for all your other controllers. So as you know, it's like my users controller inherits application controller. So if you wanted to build like new features that all your controllers have, that all your routes have, essentially aka middleware, it kind of gets built here. Okay, so that way then it becomes available to all your other routes that inherit from application controller, or all your other controllers that inherit from application controller. So we want to build in this ability for authorization here, because we want every other model to be able to apply this authorization. So we paste this from our tutorial, and basically the way this works, okay, is that we have this before action called authorized, okay, which is just, so if we walk through it, the idea here is before you access any route in this controller, which you can't directly access application controller, so it's really just the model for other controllers, but theoretically, before you access this controller, it would run authorize. What authorize does, it says please log in, it returns a message of please log in unless logged in returns true. And if login returns true, which just checks in, is the user logged in? Logged in user checks to see if the decoded JSON token has a user in it and adds the user to an instance variable on the controller. So that way all the routes can use it. Okay, but this whole decoded token thing here, that's a function, which is this function here, which goes inside the header, which gets the authorization header, which is another function that actually grabs the authorization header from the request and takes that authorization header, removes the token from it, because the authorization header is a string that looks like this. So you got to take out that word bear from it and just parse out the token. So that's what it's doing here. Okay. It then decodes the JWT token. Okay, using your secret, so your secret's gonna match whatever you have on encode. Okay, you could use an environmental variable there if you want, but we'll keep it simple today. And then it returns you the decoded token, or if it fails, it returns nil. And then again, that gets returned to this function, logged in user. And then if that all goes well, that'll return true to here, which returns true to here, which means you've passed all the checks, you're logged in. If not, then you would get the whole please log in message. So that's kind of how all these work. This is used when you log in to encode your username. Cool. Now let's head on over. So that's the application controller. Okay, I already broke all that stuff down. And then the user's controller is going to have these methods. I'm going to copy that over, head over to the user's controller, paste these functions. Okay, and what we're saying here, before action, again, before action is something that runs before the route on that controller gets run. Authorize, and again, it's getting authorized because it inherits it from application controller. But it's saying only run authorize beforehand, not for all these controller functions, but only for auto login. Okay, the other ones don't need it because you're not logged in before you create a new user, and you're not logged in before you actually log in. Now there's a couple helper functions down here, okay, which is just user params. That actually grabs the parameters from the request. So it's saying, hey, we are doing this for, we need to grab username, password, and age from the parameters. That's all that's doing. Okay, it's a private function, so you can't, it's only used inside of the controller. It's just a helper function for these other controller routes functions. So if I want to create a user, what does it do? I send over the information via a post request. It's going to create a user using the params that we sent in. And then it's going to see if the user is valid, meaning does it match the schema. Token. Then what it does is going to create a token. So this encodes a new token using JWT. Then it will send back the JSON information on the user. Else, it'll say like invalid username or password. Logging in, same idea. Takes the information we send in, finds the user, compares the password using the authentication method, and then it'll encode the token, send back a token, and then you're good to go. And then if we make a post to auto login, it's going to check to see if we had a token in the header, which we'll practice in a second. And if it works, then we're good and we can move on. So that should be all it takes to be set up. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So let's test our app. So that's Rails server. So I'm going to go open up in terminal Postman, because that's how I have it set up on my computer. There we go. So it's localhost 3000. And first let's try logging in. Log in. And that's going to be a post request to log in. Body, that's going to be username. Alex Merced, password. I think it was pineapple. So now when I hit the post request, I send that in there. Let me just think about this. JSON, raw, that's all good. We hit send. And see, I successfully logged in. So it returned me my user. The only thing I really care about is the token. So I'm going to take the token, copy the token, and I'm going to head over to my headers. And I'm going to delete this. So I have this authorization header. And actually what I'm going to do, yeah, no, this is fine. Authorization header, which I added. So originally there was no authorization header. You add the authorization header, and what you have to type in is bearer, because that's just the standard format, space, and then the actual token. Okay, so there's the token, and that needs to be in your header. So now let's try auto login. I think it will just like that. Auto login, and we'll use that. I think that was a get request with our header in it. And see, there we go, it worked. Okay, now if I didn't have the header in it, so let's take off the authorization header. Please log in. So it only will, so basically that's the point of the JWT token. It just makes sure once I receive that token from logging in, that's how I make requests to everywhere else in my app. I need to have that token in my header, which is something you build into your front-end logic. So your front-end logic will make sure to take that token from the response on login, and then make sure to include that in all future requests going forward. So that way you know it's an authenticated request. So let's build our notes model. Control C. Okay. So let's do Rails G. And I'm going to do scaffold. Scaffold builds everything for you. Okay. Scaffold like the ultimate command in Rails. It'll build your model, your controller functions, your migrations, everything. Okay, so we'll get this up and running in really quick. So Rails G scaffold note, because this is going to be a notes app. Okay, and now this note is going to have a field called message, which is the string with the note. It's going to have a user, which is a reference field, because it references the user field. Which user does this message belong to? And that's it. So Rails G scaffold note. So I type in that command, I hit enter. Okay, so now everything is created. So now, when I go to, first let's do models. I go to models. There is my user. But in my note, here's my note, and it says belongs to user. So that tells Rails that that this model is related to the user model, and it needs to have a user specified in every entry. Okay, so that's cool. Application. Already talked about that. So now let's go to controllers, users, notes, and see here it has all the notes functions already created for me for full CRUD. There's a couple modifications I do want to make here. And then there's my migration file in DB, migrate. Let's just make sure that all looks good to me. So references, user, that all looks good to me. So in that case, first we'll just migrate the database. Rails DB migrate. Okay, and then after doing that, what I want to do is modify the controllers for notes. Because right now, notes gets all notes. I don't want it to get all notes. I just want it to get the ones where the user is the user. So if I remember right, what I would do is we just do notes where, and then it's like where user ID equals. Let me take a look at my sample project. It's giving me at the moment exactly how I set that up. Config app controllers. Message params. it's up here. Oh no, I updated over here. Okay, note where. Yep, that's where I'm going. Okay, so just explain this. So where user ID, and because it's going to, when it creates a reference field, it doesn't create a field called user in the database. It creates a folder called user_ID. And I want that to match the user ID. And this user instance variable got created in our authentication. So if we go back to our application controller, right here, when it checks to see if the token's valid, that's when it creates that user variable. So now the user is available in our routes, which is nice. So now I can just reference it there. So basically, it'll only give me back the notes that belong to that user. Okay, and then the other thing I want to do is when we create a note, I want to make sure that it adds the user ID each time. So here it creates a new note, and now I just want to update that note. So up note.id equals at user.id. Okay. Let me just get rid of some of the stuff here. Let me just double check one thing. Yeah, that's how I did it. Okay, cool. And then basically it'll then save, and then that's all good to go. Let me just think if there's any other changes here. I mean, you can do other changes to your delete and update, but I mean, technically if you do those two changes, depending on how you build your front end, it shouldn't matter too much. I mean, other than just having more security and being more secure. But cool. And then again, this is the function, the helper function, to grab the params that we send in. So it says, hey, the param sent in needs to match the schema of a note, and what's allowed to send in is a message and user ID, the two properties we created on that model. Okay, and then this just sets a note for like updates. I think that's used in the update one. Where's set note used? Oh, I think it's used in... Yeah, it's used somewhere in there. Okay, but it's just another helper function. Okay, cool. And then again right here, what we want to do is we want to add before action. And we want to set up authorization. Let me just make sure that matches what we have here. Authorized. That's the correct word, is authorized. Because that's how it was created, authorized. Because again, it's inheriting that from our application controller. Authorized right here. Okay. And what that does, it's just going to be, before we hit up any of these routes, it's going to just double check if the JWT token is in there. So now the only way for me to successfully do these routes is to have the JWT token. So let me just do a Rails server, because that should be all good to go. Okay, and I already have my JWT token in there. That's the cool thing about JWT tokens, is until they expire, they're good. Which, you know, under the hood, you try to set up expiration dates and whatnot, but that's a conversation for another time. Let's see here. So this is going to be, I think it's going to be called notes. And right now, if I go to get notes, which would just, you know, get all the notes, it should give me nothing, an empty array. See, just an empty array. So let's add a note. Post body. So again, the two properties are message. Okay. Message, and so message in a bottle. And then it's supposed to be the user ID, which will be 1 because it's the only user we have right now. So let's see here and see if that gets created. There we go. And there it was created. And then I'll create a couple more. Jeez. What happened there? Duplicate key value. That's interesting. So we'll have to kind of get rid of the unique on that. So we'll check here. Why does it think it needs to be unique? Let's go back to our migration files. Config db migrate. I'm looking at the wrong one. Note app. Models db migrate user null false foreign key. Okay, because it should be. What I probably should have done is just change this to a belongs to, but it's too late for that now at the moment. I don't want to get into the whole reversing migrations discussion at the moment, but the idea is we created the API. It does check to see if you added it. I have to kind of adjust that to see to make that not where basically you can create multiple messages, multiple notes with the same user. Okay, but the idea is that now if I go over here, make it a get, it'll bring us back the one message we've created so far. So it's for the most part working. You kind of see what we did. And again, if I had done that, if I take off the authorization header, it's going to say I need to log in. So see, you can only do those things if you're authorized. And that's kind of the point. So in the next video, now that we've created our API, I'll look into making that not unique, make a video where we refer to that, and then you guys can, we'll start building out the front end. So I'll see you guys there. Ciao.